Welcome to the third panel, one entitled Guaranteeing Peace with the Guarantors. And I think you're all aware of who the panelists are, but just in case, we have former Prime Minister Tony Blair, former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, and former President Bill Clinton. And I thought what I might do is to ask each of them a series of questions, but then also, since this is a day devoted to reflecting, ask each of them also to reflect on their experiences. These are all very seasoned political leaders who've had the opportunity to lead their nations. They've confronted all kinds of domestic and international challenges. And so thinking about, from their perspectives, especially for the students who are interested in politics and government, what they now believe and feel reflecting back. But first, we're going to start with, some of the background that led each of them to play the roles that they did in the Good Friday Agreement. And let me start, if I could, Tony, with you. I think it's fair to say that when you became Prime Minister, for many people in the UK, but far beyond the UK, the Northern Ireland troubles had seemed insoluble, that they were really bred in the bone, that there was very little that could make a difference. So what made you, as Prime Minister, coming in with a big agenda, because I remember your first election, there were a lot of things you wanted to do and talked about during the campaign, to believe that there could be some resolution of the troubles and that you wanted to do everything you could to explore that?
First of all, thank you very much indeed for having me here at Queen's, and to be alongside President Clinton and Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, who the two people who did so much to help bring the Good Friday Agreement about. And this is my first time ever to be interviewed by you, by the way, so I'm slightly... a little bit.
They're all a little nervous, if you haven't noticed.
Yeah.
Especially the panelists in the middle.
It's the follow-ups that'll get him in trouble.
Well, that's the voice of experience, so I should listen to it. So I think when we came to power, obviously, and it's important to say this, John Major had tried hard. He'd started a process. John Hewman had been a constant arguer that it was possible. And, John, I remember, when I was in the House of Commons as the leader of the opposition, and in Parliament, you're going through the voting lobbies, John Hume would wait strategically for me as I was going through the lobbies, and he would back me into a corner. And John was someone who was very persuasive, but they weren't short conversations, right? So, but the thing that he drove home to me the whole time was that it was possible. He said, "I know people tell you it's impossible, it's possible." And then I was explaining to people earlier my own family background. Obviously, my mother was from Donegal in Ireland, but even though living in the Republic, they'd been a Protestant family, and I'd grown up with the Troubles being very much part of my youth and my own personal history. So I was determined for all sorts of reasons to try to do things. And then, actually, as leader of the opposition, I had met Bertie Ahern, who at that time, I think, Bertie, first time I met you weren't the Taoiseach. And I also kind of felt, when I had that conversation with Bertie, there was something I felt that could be done. There was we were coming up to the end of the 20th century, or a new millennium. There was a new generation taking charge in various places. Obviously, we were huge fans of what President Clinton and yourself were doing in the US. Everything kind of aligned. And so, and maybe this was just also the fact that we were new in government and, and hadn't had time to become cynical. So we just thought, now let's give this a go. And I remember discussing it with one of my deputy prime minister, John Prescott, who said to me, I don't know why you're doing this. He said, they absolutely hate each other over there, you know. And I said no, I'm going to give it a go. And so we did. Yeah, that's, I felt, and I suppose there always this moment in time when things seem to come together. And so at least I thought it was worth giving it the best shot.
I think it's also important the role that relationships played, and the story you just told about John Hume really illustrates that. And earlier in one of the panels, Jerry Adams was talking about how he and John Hume began a conversation even, like, I think it was 12 years before the Good Friday Agreement. And, you know, John's genuineness, his authentic spirit and heart were just contagious, weren't they? I mean, you couldn't not listen to John Hume with his passionate belief in the goodness of people and the potential for peace without going away shaking your head, yes, it's possible.
Yeah.
But I also think you referenced the relationship with Bertie Ahern, too. And you know, as someone who had the benefit of observing all three of you, you really each had a unique political and personal capacity to connect with others. And Bertie particularly had a real skill with that. And so, Bertie, when you became Taoiseach, after having been in politics, obviously having observed what was happening in the North, how did you think about whether there was a path forward?
Well, I suppose the troubles had gone on so long, and all of us, Albert Reynolds before me, John Major, you know, it was just an issue you felt you had to try. And of course, you're meeting all the party leaders, and you know, I was meeting John, meeting Jerry, and meeting all of the political leaders. And I was lucky enough to meet you, President, when you came over in '95. I was leader of the opposition, so I was to get 10 minutes with you up in the ambassador's residence in Phoenix Park, and you gave me an hour. You obviously had nothing to do that day, but anyway. And then I had got to know Tony well, and we had met in Dublin. We'd met in the Gresham Hotel was the first time I'd met Tony, and we'd met in both parliaments. So I felt, you know, listen, this was worth it. And Tony had made it very clear he was going to give this a real crack. His first speech, even though he, you know, was huge celebrations coming in as the Labour Prime Minister, you know, huge crowds, and the first thing he did was come to Northern Ireland. So I mean, he couldn't show more serious intent than that. He went to the Balmoral Agricultural Show, and my job. He has a big farm in Chequers as well. But we got working on it, and I think, you know, we went back and met you, Jerry. The thing was to get the ceasefire back on track and to get moving. So I think from then on, you know, from that summer of '97, all the way up to Good Friday, like it seemed like every day, but it was certainly every week. I hold a record which will never be beaten of the Irish Prime Minister, Irish Taoiseach, that was in number 10 more than anywhere else. I can tell you that. I was there every week, and the food was always good, unlike Castle Buildings. And so I think that's how it got going. So the relationship was good, and of course, President, whenever ever we needed you. Sometimes it said you stayed up all night in the last few days, but the reality was you were there all the time for us, and I think that's how the relationship developed, Hilary.
So, Bill, you also have an interesting pathway to the decision to become so actively involved and working with Tony and Bertie, and eventually asking George Mitchell to serve as your envoy and be deeply involved. Can you give us a sort of timeline, if you will, of how you ended up working with Tony and Bertie and being so committed to trying to resolve the troubles?
Well, first of all, I think whenever you hear politicians like us talk, you shouldn't discount what we say, but you should try to make sure you got the context right. That is, almost everything you do, particularly if you win an election and you have executive responsibilities, is a combination of something you care about, something people you care about ask you to do, and then you have to figure out how you're going to do it and survive. And all this stuff seems so straightforward today and easy, and it wasn't. I mean, I got interested in this when I came to Oxford in 1968, and the trouble started in '69. And Bernadette Devlin was an attractive young woman who got elected to Parliament, and all the kids liked her. We didn't know jack about this, a lot of us, but it got people thinking about Ireland in a different way. And then all the troubles happened, and they were happening when I was there. And then over the years, when I would go back to the UK or to Ireland, I would keep up. And then when I was running for president, I knew that I had to be up to date on the Irish issue when I went to New York to the primary, and when I went to Massachusetts. And this big group in New York asked me to come to a meeting, and my opponents were there, the ones that were left by the time we got to New York. And so it looked like I was going to win the nomination if I didn't screw it up, frankly, then. But there was this big attempt to derail me. And there were people who think, oh, well, you don't want to take any chances. But I had some people working with me, and people I'd gotten to know who were part of the Irish community in New York, who actually thought I should agree to appoint a special envoy, which then was heresy. That's before there were any peace talks for George Mitchell to mediate. And I got there late one night. Everybody else who was trying to beat me had already put in their best shot. And they asked, and I made up my mind. I said, all right, I'm not going to bring this up, but if they ask, I'm going to tell them the truth. Yes, I will appoint a special envoy. And they told me, they said, you have no idea how hard this is going to be for you to keep this commitment. People will think you're insane. The State Department had operated for decades under a theory that our relationship with the UK was so important we couldn't mess it up. Even President Kennedy, in his heralded visit to Ireland, did not go to the North and did not talk about it. And, it was one of those things that wasn't done. Well, I thought it was crazy to deny such a large problem's existence and to take a pass when we had the biggest Irish diaspora. We had people who were part of a big Irish population that were pro-unionist, as well as the people that filled the bars and other places in Boston and New York who were Republicans. And so they asked me, would you do this? And I said, yes. And it sounds good, and then you have to do it. So I got elected. And then everybody was telling me why I shouldn't do it. And Nancy Soderberg, who was on the previous panel here, she was on my national security staff. And she and Tony Lake and Sandy Berger they favored naming a special envoy. And everybody else thought I was crazy. The British press was so bad that they were speculating that John Major, I just did it to burn John Major because he checked my passport files for the Bush campaign in '92. I mean, really, like I would change all American policy just to give it. Today, there are people spiteful enough to do that, but I was too dumb to think like that. And and everybody was going nuts. They said, "Oh my God, Clinton is so pissed off at Major for checking his passport files to see if he tried to give up his citizenship to join the Soviet Union." I mean, go figure. That's the only reason he's doing this. I mean, it was like that's how inconceivable it was to the whole British Barty politic. And I told John Major, and I respected it. Tony mentioned I respected that Major tried because he was on a very thin parliamentary majority, and he needed the Unionist members of Parliament, and he risked it anyway. And even though, as we point out, it didn't really go anywhere, he tried, and I think we should all give him credit for trying. It was easy for and the Taoiseach at the time, Albert Reynolds, thought I should grant Jerry a visa. And so we all worked it out. There were 7 Irish groups and mostly based in New York City that wanted him to come. And one of them sponsored a conference. They put together a whole speech deal, and he asked for a visa, and we agreed so I could make the United States look like an impartial body, that I would grant the visa for 2 days, but there would be no fundraising. And everybody knew that a lot of money was going into Ireland from the Northeast United States especially, but not on this trip. We were going to send a signal that we wanted to be involved, but we wanted it to be positive, and we wanted to be fair to everybody. And we have 2 people who are members of Congress here now, at least then. Richie Neal, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and Marty Meehan, who years ago became president of the University of Massachusetts, but he was there then. And Peter King called me to wish me well right before I left, who became my best Republican supporter because he was from Limerick. And his mother said, "If you try to run that president out of office, I'll never speak to you again." So eventually there were certain benefits about it. But at the time it was crazy, they thought. I thought it made all the sense in the world because what we were doing is not working. And it seemed to me, just from the talk, that the public was maybe way ahead of the politicians in their desire to have some sort of resolution of this. So I gave Jerry the visa, and he kept his word, as he always did in dealing with me, and the rest is history. And it brought me closer to Tony, and he was interested. It meant a lot to me because I loved it when he won on his whole campaign platform, was basically consistent with what I believed. And he and Cherie and Hillary and I had an interesting dinner together not long after he became PM. And then I met Bertie, and I thought, Bertie had the kind of BS that I always wished I had. I thought, I want to be Bertie when I grow up. It was great. So we all got along. And that's a big deal if you trust somebody. Because if you make enough decisions under this kind of pressure with all these changing circumstances, some of your decisions will be wrong or will be questioned or will not be good for one of your partners on any given day. It just happens. You can't, nobody's perfect. You can't foresee all this. And the fact that we trusted each other, and we trusted eventually, I think we earned the trust of the parties in Northern Ireland that we were dealing with pretty much across the board, because they thought we would be straight with them. And that's how it happened. And it turned out to be, you know, there were days when I felt like I was a ward politician in Chicago, Hillary's hometown, and there were days I felt like I was taking Seamus Heaney's advice to just take a flying leap and walk on air against your better judgment. So, but that's how it started. We all just decided that the time was right to do the right thing. There are lots of people here who were involved in this, from all over, including General DeChaslin, who had to oversee the decommissioning of arms, which was highly controversial at the time. People thought we were crazy to think it could ever be done. You remember the first time it brought up? So we were all out here just, we'd like to tell you that we had it all thought through, but the truth is we made up a lot of it as we went along. We had to wing it. And then when Mitchell came in, he organized our efforts.
Well, again, I think I think the importance of relationships, the importance of building trust, just really are key to everything that happened afterwards. So, Tony, you made this kind of leap of faith that you were going to be committed to doing everything that you could. As you began that effort, what did you have in mind? Where did you think your commitment was going to lead in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, just before I come to that, I should say I was also very grateful to President Clinton, because he was very good to me even when I was leader of the opposition. And in particular, I know you probably don't even remember this, but when I was leader of the opposition, I got the chance to go meet the President of the United States. Now, when you're the leader of the opposition in the UK, you go meet the President of the United States, the visit's got to go well, okay? It's got to go well. So I'm running up to my election, and the President was about to seek re-election in the US. So I go and see him in the Oval Office, right? It's a great thing. And we're sitting there in those two chairs like you do in the Oval Office. And they bring the press in a great scrum, right? So all the press come in. And you know what the British media is like. So you're always a little, what's going to happen? So they come in a big scrum, and someone throws a question to President Clinton. They say, Mr. President, do you think you're sitting alongside the next British Prime Minister? And I completely freeze, because I think, what can he say? Because he can't say yes, because that would be undiplomatic and diss John Major. On the other hand, if he says no, the visit's not gone so well, right? So he says, I just hope he's sitting alongside the next President of the United States. Yeah. And so I always thought, yeah, that guy could do Prime Minister's questions. So when we began this, the first thing we did, and I think this is a really important element for any peace process, is we agreed to talk to everybody. And, in the end, with the peace process in Northern Ireland, I mean, okay, we had difficult jobs to do, but the people who had the really difficult jobs were the politicians in Northern Ireland, because they were taking risks, and they were also having to say to their own supporters, who had built up a narrative over a long period of time, we're going to change strategy, we're going to move, we're going to do things differently. And so, for David Trimble, he had to make, this was a really, really difficult set of decisions he had to take. Seamus Mallon, and then, of course, for Sinn Féin as well. And then you had loyalist groups. So you had a whole range of different people, all of whom were going to have to take difficult decisions to move this process along. And I think the most important thing, starting point for this, is that we were prepared to go and talk to everybody. And I remember, I mean, Jerry will remember this well. I mean, the first meeting I had with Sinn Féin, with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, I mean, at the time, this was, very shocking to people. And you had to be prepared to do it. And I remember after I did it, I don't know whether people any here recall this, then after I met them for the first time, I then went to a shopping center for a visit. You meet and then you go for a visit. And I told you about this last night. When I got to the shopping center, I got in there, I was saying hello to people and so on. And then suddenly there was this huge wave of people, including people who are wearing washing up gloves. Those plastic washing up gloves. And, the last time I'd ever seen anyone wear this was my mum. And I was they're all coming together. I was thinking, what's going on here? What sort of protest is it? But this was all to do with the fact that I shouldn't have been shaking hands with Gerry Adams. Because this was a big thing, you see, that the people were saying there was a huge debate. Yes, you can meet them, but you can't shake hands with them. I said, we're going to meet them, we're going to shake hands. Let's just do what you would do one human being to another, and let's see what we can go. We know we disagree about the past, but let's see if we can agree about the future. And Mo Mowlam then went and visited the Loyalist prisoners in the maze. All of these things were difficult. I don't think anything could have happened unless we were prepared to sit down and talk to people and to understand these conflicts come about because there are two distinct narratives in opposition to each other, and the only way you will ever make peace is if one side understands how the other side feel. They don't have to agree with it. They don't even have to sympathize with it, but at least they have to understand it. And that's what happened.
I think that's a lesson that we should all not only hear but repeat to ourselves and others, because clearly you don't make peace with your friends, you don't make peace with people that you already agree with. You have to keep searching for that common ground. So Bertie, when you realized that there was going to be a serious commitment from the Blair government, and then that the United States, with then President Clinton, would also be engaged, how were you thinking about what needed to happen in order for this to work? Because you had literally lived with it, you've watched it, you knew a lot of the players, and so you had a ringside seat for years, but all of a sudden it looks like it might be real, and you had to figure out what you could do and how you could support it.
Yeah, we got a few lucky breaks, I must say. We decided September 97 that the talks were going to start, and it didn't start too good, because the first day we had said, listen, the Mitchell principles, you can't be involved in violence, and you can't be in the peace talks. So everyone signed up to the Mitchell principles, and so that was good. So Sinn Féin were coming into the talks, and you'll never guess what happened. The DUP walked out, and but in fairness to Gary McMichael and Don Purtis, who were here, they walked back in with David Trimble. So, and in fairness to David Trimble, that was a brave move, and I think late David Trimble deserves a lot of credit. So we got going, and okay, I think George gave a good explanation today of what happened over those months, and it was up and down and up and down. But I think the two things that Tony and I did, that the talks were as inclusive as we possibly could make them. Everyone was in that wanted to be in, and we continued trying to get everybody in, which we did by St. Andrews. It took us a while. But, and then was as comprehensive as possible, and I think all the issues were on the table, very difficult issues, and, issues that I think people thought were impossible to deal with, decommissioning prisoners, reform of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, changing a lot of the legislation. I mean, there were huge issues, And I keep thinking today, when you look at the issues today, but anyway, we won't get into today's issues, but there were huge, huge issues. And the fact that everybody kept going, in fairness to the parties, I agree totally what, you know, Tony has said about the parties. They had to make their individual breaks. I, of course, knew that the big thing we were going to have to do, because we had the 1937 Constitution, we claimed jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. And Articles 2 and 3 were very special, you know, maybe not to me, but my father, who was an old IRA man, and my mother, who loved Tony Blair but didn't like everybody from that end of the world. And so there were difficult choices, but we all had to do something. And I think that was the issue, that everybody, and it took us time. It took over that winter, autumn, winter into the springtime. But everybody knew they had to make tough decisions. And the reality was that everybody did. And I think that was the great thing about it, that people were prepared to say, well, we have our bit to do. The governments are doing their bit. The President of the United States is doing his bit. And if we all do it together, the comprehensive, inclusive process, then it's for the betterment of Northern Ireland. And amazingly, that's how it played out.
You know, this morning, Senator Mitchell said there would not have been a peace process without John Hume, and there would not have been a peace agreement without David Trimble. And I think that, you know, it's really important, especially because they're no longer with us, to remember the roles that each of them played. But every person at the table, everybody involved in the process, I think it's fair to say, was a unique personality and leader, and trying to work through all of their concerns, their personal experiences, their grievances, their hopes. All of that was so difficult, as you said, Bertie, because, you know, it was so inclusive, but by being inclusive, you had to bring everybody literally to the table and then to an agreement. And, you know, Bill, part of what I know you did was to work to develop personal relationships with a lot of the leaders, so that you could call them, they would be invited to Washington for the St. Patrick's Day celebration at the White House, other kinds of events. Could you talk a little bit about how you and George Mitchell discussed managing such a big process, such an inclusive process, and how you build trust with people who start off from such different perspectives?
Well, first, when we started talking about this, and especially after I gave the visa to Jerry, then everybody settled down, and whether they were for it or against it, they said, well, maybe America's serious and we need to be consulting with them. So I tried to meet with as many as I could, and then we used St. Patrick's Day as an excuse, if you will, the annual White House ceremony, to invite people there and then to either get them to talk to each other or get them to talk to me individually until we could get everybody together. But we tried to find venues in which people would feel comfortable, not embarrassed, and could get cover if they needed it. And I think that's important because, yes, it's important that people talk to each other, but they have to be able to say what they think and outline what the problems are. And one of the things I must say that I had almost no experience with before I got up to my ears in this was multi-party democracies. You know, because we have two main parties in America, and usually if a third party gets going, its main consequence is to screw things up for one of the two main parties, because they can't ever win enough votes in our system to win the White House or win, you know, very few Senate seats or congressional seats or governorships. So I was literally fascinated for years. The whole time I was there for 8 years, I was fascinated by why people were in what party and what it meant to them. And I found that every single one of them that I talked to had a good reason that went well beyond any kind of personal ambition. That I belong to this party because of A. I belong to that party because of B. And I found it incredibly enlightening. And I found that if we were making headway with some of the parties that may not have had such big numbers, it still affected the chemistry because we had a reputation for listening and trying to respond to problems. But we did a lot because of St. Patrick's Day, and then we did a lot when I went places, and I was talking to Tony and Bertie all the time. And then once in a while, even in the beginning, Mitchell would give me marching orders, and I would salute and do what he asked.
You know, I want to go to that last week, the push, because earlier it was mentioned that both you, Tony, and you, Bertie, actually came to Belfast. Can each of you describe what that last week was like? Because in retrospect, it seems like such a high-wire act, and the fact that it all came together at the end is nothing short of a miracle. But you were both of you, so intensely involved. And take the audience sort of behind the scenes of what those last days were like.
Well, for Bertie, I should say, too, they were particularly difficult personally because you lost your mother, I think, just as the process began, and you came straight back afterwards, which was enormously helpful. I just want to say this about Bertie as well. He had that, it's a great political ability if you have this. I mean, he took lots of abuse during the course of this process. I mean, people would come in and be really rude to him. And I get offended on his behalf, but he was never really offended. He would just shrug his shoulders and say, they can say whatever they like. We just got to get the deal done. And it's a really interesting, anyway, I've always wanted to say publicly, properly, thank you, because it would never have happened without that. So it was a roller coaster all the way through, but we had, alongside the individual decisions that leaders had to make, we had a framework that people thought was essentially fair, right? And that framework was the principle of consent on the one side, that Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK as long as the majority of people in Northern Ireland wanted it, and on the other side, that there should be fairness and justice, and a recognition that there hadn't been, and therefore the institutions of Northern Ireland had to change. And I think you never get an agreement unless there is, at the heart of it, almost intellectually and politically, something that people think is fair. And the thing about politics that you find is, it's always a battle of reason against unreason. Right? It's always, when you take a step back and you put all the prejudices and all the background and all the history behind you, what is the sensible solution, right? If you can divine that and create it, then the rest is strategy and tactics to get there. And I think that was a very, very important part of it. But also we were, to be absolutely frank, as we carried on during the days and nights, and as George Mitchell was just saying, there were days and nights. I mean, we got a few hours sleep the whole time. Then, frankly, one thing that happened in this was that there came a sort of strange collective spirit that said, at the end of this, we can't go out there and say, anyway, it didn't work. Because the whole of the world's media by then camped outside. And I confess I was starting to get a little bit nervous of the political consequences of failure. But this was a good thing, because it was a spur to carry on working at it. And, as the other thing is that it was up and, I mean, to switch analogies, it was a seesaw the whole time, right? So suddenly one side would be completely against it, and then you had to try and bring the thing back into equilibrium again. Then the other side would be completely against it. And then, I was describing to people earlier how if you were in a room with a group of people and the next meeting was waiting to come in from the other side, I realized after a time you couldn't have them walk out, because if they walked out looking happy, the other people came in sad. So it was a total disaster for the negotiation. So, but the other thing was that you had, it echoes something that Bill was saying a moment ago. You had established the relationship where you could have what I call a strategic conversation, right? So when I was dealing with David or with Jerry and Bertie, and I would be sitting there doing a lot of the meetings together, right? So there was no, the British and Irish governments sitting there together was itself an important thing. We were able to have a strategic conversation. By that I mean, they tell you honestly what their problem is, and you try honestly to solve it. Right? And it's a really important thing, because if you can't have that properly frank exchange of where you really are in the whole thing, you can't solve the problem, right? Because people just either stick in their positions or they don't trust you enough to say, look, I know you want me to do this, but I can't. However, I might be able to do that. So you're always looking for that way through. And anyway, for 3 days it was like this. Castle Buildings is, I mean, is it still standing there? Is it still? They should, I mean, it should be a sort of monument to the wrong type of architecture, but it's a... So we were in this terrible building. The facilities were terrible. Everything was absolutely terrible. And then, and every so often, Mo, who always had a sense of humor about these things, every so often when things were really, really grim, she'd say to me, "You're really depressed, aren't you?" And I'd say, "Yeah, I'm really depressed." She said, "Time for the Women's Coalition." Seriously. And then we'd come to Women's Coalition. I'd say, "Mo, these people are really reasonable." She said, "Okay, that's the future. Now let's get back to the present." So, it was a strange psychology, and in the end, when I had the final call with David Trimble, and I think Bill had also just spoken. He, by the way, I was calling him. I mean, I used to call him, I ignored the time zone, so sometimes I was calling him, it must have been 3 or 4 in the morning, and, they put me through and you say, hi, how are you going? And I used to put down the phone and say to Jonathan, is this guy ever asleep? I mean, it's like 3 in the morning in the US, but anyway, so we had the final call with David Trimble, then we just went for it, but I think it was a combination of many things. But in the end, I come back to the same thing. You can have whatever technical agreement you like, but if the spirit is not sitting alongside it, it will never work.
That is so true. And Bertie, what are your recollections of that intense period?
Well, can I thank Tony for remembering my mum, because that was difficult. But, I think we'd set out that last week, and it was going to be intense. It was going to be, just a huge range of meetings and trying to get people to move a bit and move here and there. And, of course, like everything, you planned the week out and you said, well, some ends of this will be easy and some ends will be difficult. And then by the time you got to Monday, you realized you were wrong. Everything was difficult. And then you go up and down. I got the call. I also remember my own civil servants rang me when I was coming out of the church when my mother's removal. And they said, listen, we have to talk to you. George Mitchell is losing his hair. And I don't think he had much of it at the time either, but he was definitely fed up with everybody. And he said, listen, Strand 2 has driven the unionists mad, and John Taylor has just said that he wouldn't touch it with a 40-foot barge pole. And he said, you're going to have to get up here. So I said, well, how am I going to get up here? So anyway, we worked it out, and I went for this walk, and George Mitchell, I forgot it. I went for a walk down Griffith Avenue, which is one of the longest streets in Europe. And after at the start of it, George said, "Where are you?" And I said, "In Griffith Avenue." And about an hour and a half later, he said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Still in Griffith Avenue." But at least I went back up early in the morning. I met Tony, and we met in Hillsborough where you got food, as we know last night. Castle Buildings, you got terrible stuff. But anyway, Tony gave me a lovely breakfast. I went and calmed down David Trimble, and the 40-foot pole was put aside. And then I remember going to Jerry and to Martin and explained to them that I was going to have to move in Strand 2. And then I went to Mark and Seamus and John, and we were okay. We were prepared to move in that. Then I came back to the funeral, back up again. And then we just stayed at it non-stop. But when you look at that, I'm not going to repeat the issues, but the issues were huge. And the issues were huge on your side, Tony. You had to face a huge amount of prisoners and, the reform of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. There were huge issues. On the constitutional side, we have it. But I think the big breakthroughs, the trick of it all was that if we could get the constitutional issues off the table, and that was changing the Government of Ireland Act Section 75, which would really set up Northern Ireland, us taking Articles 2 and 3 off the table, getting the principle of consent on the table, that was the only change. And I think we should always remember that the balance of the agreement is hugely important, because that was the balance, and that still is the balance, which made Northern Ireland different to anywhere else in the United Kingdom, and people should always remember that going forward. That delicate balance, once we achieved that, I found then that, certainly with the Unionists, Mark will remember the late night meeting with David Trimble, and where Seamus Mallon, I never saw them so emotional when they got Strand 2 out of the way. We didn't have it difficult with Strand, they got Strand 1, then I'd sorted Strand 2. We had no difficulty with Strand 3. And we started making progress. And then, of course, things came up at the end. And Tony Blair had to start writing side letters. And Jonathan Powell put them in under the door because nobody had answered the door. But anyway, at least. And then David Trimble got up on the table to say, "I'm with the agreement." I mean, there were amazing things, but the compromises along the way. But I have to say, Tony is nice to me, but I have to say this to you, Tony. Some of those decisions in the last 36 hours, you were making those on your own, out reference back to your cabinet. There were huge decisions. They brought peace. You had to call them, and there were big calls, and you did a good job on them.
So we're getting toward the end. I personally could go on for a long time, but I think we should stay within the time limits given to us. And so, Bill, I want to start with your recollections of the end. I do remember all those late night phone calls, and they were pretty constant and always at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, as I recall. But if you could just share, Bill, with as you're thinking about the end, but also then I want to segue, starting with you, as to what advice, if any, would you give to political leaders and active citizens and the people of Northern Ireland right now in terms of moving forward into the next 25 years? And then I'll ask Bertie and with Tony on that same question.
Well, first of all, the last week was horrible for me because I was so full of anticipation, and I had a day job. And I was so jealous of Tony and Bertie. I felt almost as if Hillary were about to give birth to our second child, and they got to go to the waiting room. And I was kept out. But, George Mitchell would call me, and then Tony would call me, and I'd talk to Bertie. I'd call whoever I was asked to call. But the thing that I felt always was the process by which all the parties that proceeded, involved so much time, so much effort, and was done with so much respect for people across the political spectrum that I thought in the end that people wouldn't walk away. And it's a great tribute to all of them. Also, there are people we haven't mentioned, Mary McAleese and Michael here. I think the presidency of Ireland, I'm glad Ireland has a symbolic president who can bring people together. And it's a metaphor that they had a president from Northern Ireland. It was great. I don't know, I don't want to get in the way of the program, Hillary, but I think you ought to ask all the people who are here who had any part of that peace business then to stand up, because a lot of them survived and they're here. Is that okay? Would you all stand up? Mark, stand up. Everybody, Jerry, everybody. That's someone. And all the guys, look at this. Thanks. And so I'll yield my time to Tony and Bertie, but the one last thing I want to say is I think the women's groups, the other peace groups, the people who weren't always in the rooms, all those kids that became public figures by the speeches they gave, pleading for people to give them a safe future. I think they had an impact on people. I think every one of us wound up being a little better than we would have been otherwise because we had to look into the eyes of people. And I wish that in every troubled area of the world, there was some way to bring that human dimension in the way it was in the Northern Irish peace process, because it does affect you. There are a lot of these people making decisions, their parents or their children, their brothers, their sisters. That I think it would be a mistake for us to underestimate the power of their influence.
Well, Chancellor Hillary, my one bit of advice, we worked really hard, all of us collectively, and you, President, gave so much time and effort. You came to Northern Ireland, to this island of Ireland, more times than you've been anywhere in the world. And Tony and his governments and successive governments have given huge time and commitment. And between 1998 and the 13th of October 2006, we worked really, really hard to get Democratic Unionist Party on side and to move with us up to that May 2007 when we kind of felt we got our job done. No others have to finish it on. And I just really plead and deeply hope that the Democratic Unionist Party will, pay the reward back to us all to stay the road with us, because the people of Northern Ireland need them. I think the people on this island need them. We all want to work together. The alternatives are not good. We don't even think about them. So let's hope they listen to what George Mitchell said today and listen to what we're saying, that we all just get back on the track. There's too many big things to be dealing with than to be arguing about some detail that was caused over something or another, which I'm not sure what it is even. So, So just let's move forward and try and make this work.
Tony?
I think just very briefly, we know the peace isn't perfect. We know the institutions have often been rocky and unstable as they are today. And we know there's still a lot of distrust and mistrust between the communities. But we also know that Northern Ireland is a much better place than it was before the Good Friday Agreement. And the only thing I would say to today's leaders is, I think when you stand back and you reflect, you know in your heart of hearts what the right thing to do is. And you should just get on and do it.
Thank you so much to our panel ending our day of reflection. Thank you all.
Thank you.